Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're listening in the world. And we know there are always international visitors on these infrastructure intelligence webinars. My name's Andy Walker, and this is our ninth in our series of webinars looking at the whole COVID-19 situation and where we go, basically coming out of what has been an unprecedented crisis, not just for society, but obviously for the construction and infrastructure sector itself. Excuse me. We've got a really good panel as always for today's event, which is looking at, I think, the quite wide issue of infrastructure after COVID. What will it look like? Everyone, I think, in all aspects of business and society is talking about just what effect will this crisis have on how we work, what we do. Infrastructure is so central, of course, to everything that around us, and it's also been a central plank of the government's recovery plan, with Boris Johnson lately talking about build, build, build. But what is infrastructure going to look like post COVID-19? Is everything going to change? Are we never going to go in an office ever again? Are we never going to wear a suit ever again? These are some of the questions which I'm sure will be given a little bit of insights on during the course of this morning. And as I said, we've got a really good panel for you today. We've got people from Arup, from WSP, from the Royal Town Planning Institute, and also from KPMG. And I'll introduce all of our speakers in turn as they come to speak. Just a quick word on the format. After our speakers have spoken, we will have a discussion and questions that can come from you, the audience. And if you send us your questions in the questions box on the GoToWebinar desktop that should be in front of you, depending on how you're actually dialing in, then I will ask all of our panelists, or individual panelists indeed, if you have questions just for individuals, I'll ask those questions as we move into the discussion phase of the webinar itself. If you want to put your company name down when you ask a question, feel free to do that. I'm happy to give your company a name check as you ask questions through me to our panelists. Anyway, that's enough from me, the editor of Infrastructure Intelligence, Andy Walker. We're going to move to our first speaker on what I hope will be a really good discussion here this morning, and that first speaker is Tim Chapman, who is the Director of Infrastructure at Arup. Tim leads Arup's London-based infrastructure group and projects throughout the world, as befits one of the leading consultancy firms in in the world really. And the London office alone has got more than 2,500 staff working across projects in the built natural environment. Tim is someone who has a keen interest in whole system engineering to provide complete solutions. And I know that he's particularly keen on the issue of low carbon projects and net zero. And I'm sure he'll probably touch on some of those issues when he speaks any second now. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andy, and welcome to everybody. And it's great to have a chance to talk about this. In my time slot, I plan to cover two things majorly. One is about the change in demand, what we as society demand from our infrastructure. And the second is about the change in supply, which probably addresses the question that Andy set us at the very beginning. So fundamentally, we are in the middle of a crisis, probably the biggest crisis of anyone who's been alive since World War II. It is a very significant event economically. I think people said it was the biggest shock to the economy since the 18th century. So we're living through history at the moment. The various things that we're doing, the various artifacts you see will be in museums in the future. And actually, it's interesting though, because I think it's exacerbating several existing trends. Working from home used to be a byword for on the DOS. I'm going from working from home used to be in inverted commas. Now we've all experienced the reality of working from home for a long period of time. We all have an awful lot more respect for working from home, the slog and everything else. And actually, I've heard people talk about it as living in work rather than working from home. And the fact that actually it's very, very difficult to turn off. So I think there's some trends in this that are going to be very significant. I mean, one of which is actually employers have discovered that they win by giving people flexibility. And that's really good, I think, in many aspects. It's good for individuals because we are more flexible, but it's also very good for companies because productivity hasn't dropped in many ways. Yes, we've lived on stuff that we've banked. We've banked the fact that we have really good relationships with our colleagues from before, hopefully, and we're trading on that sort of capital that we built up with them for a long period of time. We've all learned to buy online an awful lot more. We've all learned the importance of supply chains and logistics. We all experienced a horrible feeling of running out of toilet paper 4 months ago and the desperation to try and find some. And the heroes who make toilet paper we now appreciate, and we go and clap for them on a regular basis. And for Amazon drivers and logistics drivers and freight. It used to be most people's popular idea of transport was actually about personal transport and people transport, and not the really rich logistic systems that we all rely on everything that happens. I think people are now much more aware of it. So the trend towards working from home was one that was actually being hampered and sort of slightly impaired. Now is going to be a full flush, which will have implications for office space. Actually, it has a huge implication for travel demand. Peak travel demand is the bit that we all struggle with in most economies, but actually peak travel demand is going to be lessened by this. And therefore, actually demand for infrastructure projects to provide that peak demand will change substantially, not go away. But actually, we've got a huge infrastructure deficit in large parts of the United Kingdom. London's got a fairly well-developed, or very well-developed transport system that ranks with the best in the world. Most other UK cities don't. And therefore, there's an awful lot still to be done just to provide the demand that should be there. And as Andy said, to move towards low carbon forms of transport. There's huge social issues coming from the current issue, lots of loneliness, lots of mental health issues of various types that we need to actually confront. And again, we're getting better at confronting and being open about mental health issues before. I think we're going to have another huge, big increase in being honest about these things, recognizing mental health is just another form of health and something that we need to actually look at like we do for physical health. How do we make better places is going to be really interesting after this. At the moment, we're used in a way to living in our own locality, not traveling into cities. And the whole purpose of cities has been called into question. Are we all better going to living somewhere by the coast or up in Durham or somewhere else like that in the future? Or what's going to happen to the big cities afterwards? Cities need to rediscover themselves. London has rediscovered itself several times over the past millennium, 2 millennia even. Most recently, with sort of the deregulation of financial services led to London resurging hugely from the 1980s. But London needs to rediscover itself to remind people why it exists. And so lots of aspects of that. So I think there's some really interesting trends. I mentioned actually about peak travel demand. Actually, flight shaming was becoming a thing beforehand, and now we all flight shame. I don't know anyone who's been on a plane for a very long time. And we all have got used to taking holidays and working out what really matter about holidays. Do we need to travel to the other side of the world for holiday, or is it just extra hassle? And as well as a disease risk. So there's many trends, I think, that from our demand that will change hugely. Talking about supply, and again, everyone's hoping that we're going to suddenly bounce back, and in the midst of COVID, we're going to invent a whole lot of new cycle lanes and metros and nuclear power stations and wind farms that mean they're going to bounce back straight away into a totally different future. I hope COVID will end in the next year or two. I hope there is a vaccine in the reasonably near future, and therefore we get back to a form of normality. We're all existing in this really odd twilight world of actually not getting close to people, which is a very weird thing for humans to do. It's totally against our evolution. And therefore, as I said, there will be implications of that. So I'm going to split the recovery and supply of infrastructure into 3 phases. I think there's a first phase of actually the quick bounce back. Government wants to reflate the economy very quickly. They want to get people back to work. They need to actually get cash into the economy and pump cash in by ways other than furloughing. So there will be a really, really short term of shovel-ready projects that are going to get going. This is going to include things like HS2, which is great, big long-term strategic change, but there's not enough shovel-ready big strategic projects waiting in the wings to go ahead in the next year. And people are talking about whether we're going to actually relax planning norms to let that happen. But equally, I think society and civil society will kick up hugely if we do that in a very big way. And a lot of the projects that might try and be fast track might just end up in a mire of being JR'd and everything else. So my first phase is the very, very quick shovel-ready build back of stuff that's basically largely ready to go, will go quickly and will hopefully be good, but might be quite mixed. The second phase are the things that we can start in this Parliament. Proposals that resonate with the government's current agenda, and we need to work really hard to work out how we're going to level up the country. And I think there's an interesting both juxtaposition of leveling up, which I agree with entirely, and low carbon, which is another crisis we need to deal with. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they work against each other. There's not the very neat way that actually every levelling up project is going to be low carbon and vice versa. And we need to come up to these trade-offs. We need to address them honestly in a way that comes to the right strategy for the country and get rid of the so-called experts foisting solutions on people who then don't want them. So there's a really interesting piece of what we do in the second wave of projects to make sure we build a consensus behind the right thing happening. I hope there's going to be lots more electrification of rail, lots of EV charging points, hopefully more nuclear, getting us a decent base load, low carbon energy, various things like that that can move reasonably quickly in maybe the timescale of 1 or 2 or 3 years that we all need to get behind and make sure the right things happen. And then there's a third phase of projects which will require a big national consensus to be created to create a sort of change towards this low carbon future. And we don't yet have the strategy in place to make sure all of these are going to come together. We need to concoct it quickly to try and make sure we can build on the current enthusiasm. So my third phase of projects are the ones that take a longer time to get together, but it's worthwhile taking that longer time to make sure we build a consensus so that people will support them. And these are projects that support human health and well-being, because actually, why are British cities different to Dutch cities? Dutch cities in 1970 were indistinguishable. They had bad parking, lots of traffic and everything else, but they invested over 50 years to make a difference. We need to have the same amount of rainfall, same climate, same wind. There's no reason why British cities have to be different to Dutch cities, but we need to make sure we invest slowly, steadily in the right measures for those to take place. And they will actually come back into really positive side of actually human health, mental health, giving people better, get rid of obesity and other things like that. Then the things to do with human dignity, making sure we actually provide employment around the country, we give people aspiration. So there needs to be a society in the future that the whole country will support and rally around. And that includes built environment. We need to invent the things, create the things that will actually do this long-term levelling up. As Andy said, I totally believe in climate change. It's a huge thing waiting to engulf us. Unfortunately, it's less critical. And I say unfortunately because actually we've shown that humanity can rally around a big crisis that's immediate and everyone will act responsibly to stop granny dying. But actually, it's not granny dying in this particular case. It's actually kids who aren't born yet are going to have futures that will be indescribably bleak. And that's a very difficult thing to get across. We need to actually get that across properly. And the fourth thing I'm going to talk about in terms of the Build Back Better, the third, this final phase, is biodiversity loss. If we need to make sure that we deal with climate change, equally we need to actually not trash all the other forms of the planet. And we come back to the SDGs. We're really ruining SDGs 13, 14, and 15, and we need to do them an awful lot better than we have been. So that's the end of my 7 minutes-ish.
Thanks, Tim. You covered quite a lot of ground there. Interesting about that phased sort of recovery that you talked about there, about shovel-ready, build-back projects, and then moving on to the stuff that could be done in this parliament and the kind of things around the levelling up agenda, which we're hearing a lot about at the moment. Just only yesterday, the government announced more investment in rail in the north. Which for anybody who lives up north, people can see how desperately needed that actually is. And also interesting that you flagged up the example of Holland, because we've heard a lot of different examples of different European countries and how they have not just come through this crisis, but also dealt with their infrastructure. And I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned. I was only speaking to someone this morning who was mentioning about what was happening in New Zealand, which I think is quite an interesting comparison, particularly to some of the larger regions and countries that we have in the United Kingdom. So there's a lot of examples and learnings, I think, to be had going forward. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those questions in the discussion. A further reminder to people, if they want to put their questions into the questions box, and we'll make sure that they're asked of our panelists in the discussion part of the webinar a little bit later on. Anyway, to our next speaker, and that next speaker is Rachel Skinner, who is the Executive Director for Transport at WSP. Rachel is also a Senior Vice President of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and provided nothing untoward happens on this webinar or anything else for the next few months, she's set to become the youngest ever president of that august institution when she takes office later this year. Rachel also in the past helped set up the Women in Transport organisation. I only mentioned that partly because I wanted to, but also because we actually have a speaker from next week's webinar, which is going to be looking at the skills crisis in construction, which is very, very topical, especially given that the talent retention scheme is actually being launched this very afternoon. Also on Rachel, she's also one of the 10 commissioners at the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland. And interestingly enough, they have an important report coming out on Monday calling for a new approach to Scotland's infrastructure. And I actually started my day at 8:30 this morning by interviewing Ian Russell, the chair of the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland. So there you go. I think they might even be on this webinar. And if they are, a big hello to the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland. Anyway, that's enough waffle from me. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you. No pressure. Hey, there we go. I'll try not to mess it up for any of those perspectives. So I'm going to use my few minutes this morning to talk a bit, first of all, about what I think COVID hasn't changed, and then offer a few thoughts around what I think it might have taught us so far, trying not to overlap too heavily with what Tim's already given us, most of which I wholeheartedly agree with. And I think then to close with some thoughts around how we might actually tackle what lies ahead, because genuinely, I don't think we're going to get a better opportunity than we have right now to show how infrastructure is really relevant and really genuinely critical to the challenges that we're likely to face next. So trying to kind of rattle through that fairly briefly. So I guess my kind of opening statement here is fundamentally, in a kind of a physical but also a digital sense, really, infrastructure itself hasn't fundamentally changed because of COVID. The assets themselves are still broadly what they were until COVID obviously knocked us sideways a few months ago. But what COVID has done, it's flagged up all sorts of fairly fundamental resilience issues around the demand side of our lives. And for quite a while, obviously, we found that we weren't able to get or to do necessarily exactly what we wanted when we wanted to. And as Tim was saying, it's really made us rethink whether all those things that we thought we were going to do were actually things that were necessarily the right things in the first place. And I think you can really think that one through at a kind of a personal level, a professional level, and indeed at sort of whole of society level. But I think, I mean, as I say, ultimately, the kind of certainly the physical side of things, you know, the supply side of the equation for infrastructure, all of it's still out there. And the question really becomes, well, what do we want to do with it next? You know, we've got these roads, we've got these railways, we've got the ability to generate energy, the digital networks, all the rest of it. But what are we going to do? And I think COVID has helped us as a kind of society, I think, to make us more aware of these networks that we rely on and perhaps take for granted or have done till now. I mean, Tim's already stolen the loo roll example, but in the sense of the logistics and delivery networks, I mean, you know, where is the loo roll? Where is the pasta? I mean, that genuinely was a question for a while, wasn't it? And the digital side of things, obviously, we've been much more reliant on digital than perhaps we could possibly have foreseen. And for those of us with decent digital provision, we're probably sat here thinking, oh, thank goodness COVID didn't happen maybe 5 or 10 years ago. You know, we're quite fortunate maybe in the professional services space that, broadly speaking, our work has been able to continue after a sort of a deep breath moment when we all tried to see whether or not our corporate systems would manage to flip across or not. But for those, I guess, for whom digital connectivity has been a long-running issue, and I think here we can talk about the UK or indeed beyond, actually COVID has really exposed that, because suddenly, you know, the reliance on digital to go about what would otherwise be considered kind of everyday life is much more difficult. And I think, I mean, certainly coming back to a kind of a UK infrastructure side of things, it's been a sort of a quietly bubbling challenge, but actually we aren't doing very well, if we're honest, around the rollout of both the wired and the wireless networks around certain parts of the country. You know, highly variable provision, and certainly, you know, very, very patchy even now in many communities who still can't get access to genuinely fast services and so on. And yet we say it's really important. Now is clearly a time when we need to start thinking about what we're going to do with that, especially as some of those costs are coming down. And obviously in terms of transport, mobility, my favourite subject, in terms of moving around, whether we look at the public realm, roads, public transport, obviously we've seen a complete switch, haven't we? In terms of thinking twice around where we're going, why we're going there. And as Tim was saying, the piece around essential trip making, you know, what does essential really look like? Who are really the essential workers out there, and who do we really rely on? If we're honest, if we've been asked that question and we've been doing this webinar pre-Christmas, we wouldn't have put the list together in the way we would now. There's no way. And anybody who says they would have done, I'm sorry, I struggle to believe them. So I mean, COVID really, it's helping us to see that the infrastructure itself probably isn't the problem. It's the way we want to use it going forward that's the opportunity and perhaps the challenge as well. And I think that's the bit where we need to focus going forward. Until COVID, I guess, transport and energy-wise, the network use has been hugely peaky. We've known for years that the potential of these systems could have been far greater. We haven't really chosen to kind of force that more efficient use yet. So I think there's an opportunity there. As I've said, we've taken an awful lot of it for granted, and across all the networks, really, transport, water, energy, waste, digital, so on. You know, the good or the bad, we've just kind of rolled with it. We've taken it for the way it was. We haven't really necessarily challenged things. So I think one of the things that COVID has shown us is that we can change. And we can change really fast if we want to. And it's that crisis point, I guess, that Tim was just making. So I think, you know, what we have seen during COVID is our energy use, generally speaking, has come down, as many of us have relied on a more local set of networks around the home and around our very local areas. Obviously, digital data use has remained high, but there's some really interesting stuff I was reading the other day. I think it came out of the States, actually, but I would imagine it would apply here as well, where actually our use of data is changing, and the types of devices we're choosing to use are changing because of, you know, the situation we're finding ourselves in. And in particular, we are using the ability to access information in a digital sense in a way that we're searching for things to do with our very, very local context. What is going on around me? What, you know, whether it's what is there to do, or whether it's how are things working, that kind of thing. It puts a new dimension, I think, onto place that potentially we could again play with going forward. Obviously, transport, I mean, incredible change during COVID. I mean, you know, demand has dropped as much as 90%. We've got new views, haven't we, on personal safety, overcrowding, health risks, etc. There's a real danger in my mind that we could undo 20 or more years of policy and strategy to encourage more sustainable movement, because at the moment we're sort of suggesting implicitly that travelling by car is perhaps a safer, in a health sense, option. It is certainly not a better option, though, in terms of the way that we want to put these networks together in future. So we need to figure out about how to track the active travel benefits we've been seeing, and we certainly need to figure out how to encourage people back onto public transport as we go forward. But I think it's very unlikely that those demand side of things are going to stay the same, because, I mean, again, as Tim was saying, the opportunity to work from home, however you phrase it, the opportunity to be more flexible, it's absolutely there. And those options have actually been there all along, but now we can see them differently. And I think that's, again, where it gets interesting. So in terms of what we do next and what comes next, I'm beginning to hate the phrase the new normal, because it's getting massively overused, so I'm not going to use that. But I think that the key point for me is that infrastructure overall across all the different sectors and so on, it's in our hands. And actually, we need a good set of solutions that will not happen by magic or chance, or just waking up one morning and finding that somebody else has sorted it, because actually we are the infrastructure professionals, so we need to figure it out. And I think there's a couple of things out of COVID that play into this. So as I said, COVID has shown us that fast change is possible. It's shown us a bit about what we want. It's shown us about, you know, what's possible. And I think it has also shown us that our existing infrastructure systems are not perfect, and therefore they do absolutely need change. I'm not suggesting whoever said they were, but we've kind of, you know, lived with it, I suppose. But I think beyond that, nothing to do with COVID, we need to remember we've probably already got 80 or 90% of the infrastructure already out there that we're going to have to live with through 2050 and beyond. So we need to figure out how to make much, much better use of what we've already got. We know, second, there are new technologies and business models emerging that have the potential to transform the way we use our infrastructure. So for me, in the transport space, it's absolutely about electrification. It's about increasingly connected autonomous vehicles. It's about smarter networks more generally, and that's across the whole spectrum of urban, right the way through to rural places and routes. And those are all still bubbling away with loads of energy, but we just need to figure out how they lock into a better set of solutions going forward. And of course, the big one, and the one I suspect all of us might touch on it in various ways this morning, it is that there are other things going on out there which are much, much bigger than COVID, because COVID isn't the only crisis we're battling. And on the one hand, we like to tell ourselves it's very human, isn't it? We can only handle one crisis at a time. I'm afraid there's more than one as things stand right now. COVID, of course, is the defining crisis of this year, but climate change and carbon emissions, that's the existential crisis of the decade, and quite possibly actually the century. So somehow we need to put all those building blocks together and knit them together to act really fast in a way that everyone wins. We come out of COVID in an economic sense. We also manage to get the carbon and the environmental piece in place, that the everyone wins bit, again, as Tim was saying, is really important. It's the social piece, the justice piece, and so on, making sure we do it in a way that's fair. So on the one hand, I guess it's totally understandable that the government's on a kind of a damage limitation path around the economy. This build. Of course, I mean, it's great. It's good for our industry, isn't it? Let's not complain. But actually, to me, it's the subline around faster, better, and greener that's the bit we really need to get to. It's not all just about, you know, speed all the way and so on. And I think we have to grab the opportunity to rethink the way we design and we build and we operate across all of those different objectives. So in terms of what we want to get to around outcomes, net zero carbon by 2050 in the UK, it is a legally binding target. It is not a thing we're going to wiggle around. Yes, that's 30 years away, but we have to start now. We know that infrastructure as a whole is responsible for a walloping great proportion of carbon-led impacts right now. And so we have a massive responsibility as a group to work to cut this right back really, really fast and genuinely get that reduction going and genuinely get the offsetting going so that we can achieve net zero. And as I said already, that closely aligned with that is the social justice, the equality, the fairness piece, the levelling up piece. And I think just a very brief kind of take on that from my point of view, I prefer not to think of it as a kind of a north-south thing in terms of geography around this. I think we see it within places. We see it at a very, very local level. It's a very, very sort of intricate and embedded set of issues that we really need to think about in terms of every single project that we're bringing forward and every single change we're making to the infrastructure networks. So I think, to me, that's the key. And I think infrastructure professionals have a genuinely crucial role to play in terms of breathing new life into that full sustainability definition, which frankly has been around for decades. I remember learning about it when I was a student. It came out of the Brundtland Commission Rio Earth Summit back in '92, and you know, the fact that you have to think about economy, environment, and the social side of things. We've got exactly the same pillars now, and as I said, I genuinely don't think we have a better opportunity than right now to challenge what we have been doing till now and set a new course because of COVID into something that needs to be a very different future. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Rachel. Some really interesting points made there, particularly on the levelling up agenda. You know, that infrastructure professionals have a big responsibility to look at all of these things and join them together. Something that, well, I can say this, something that I think governments haven't necessarily been great at doing in the past. And I think that's something that, you know, we need to be a little bit more vocal on. Some interesting points around the responsibility for the sector in relation to climate change as well, which has already been touched on by Tim. So again, much to much to think about in relation to questions that will come through in the discussion a little bit later on. But thanks for those remarks for now, Rachel. Our next speaker is James Harris. James is a Policy Networks Manager at the Royal Town Planning Institute, and he leads on the Institute's programmes on infrastructure, devolution, technology and strategic planning. He also manages the Transport Planning Network, which works to integrate transport and land use planning. Again, that joining up issue rearing its head once again. James has done quite a lot of research across the sector, and I'm sure he'll be drawing on some of that and some of the experiences when he speaks right now. So James,
Thanks, Andy. And yeah, great follow up from Rachel and Tim. I'll try not to just say the exact same stuff, try and veer it off a little bit. But I mean, I totally agree with what you're both saying. You know, there's just been a ton of calls to not just build back, you know, to build back better from this crisis. So not just reboot the economy, but also create a kind of more sustainable, resilient and inclusive society. That's what we're all about, and that's what a lot of our research is focusing on. And of course, infrastructure investment is going to be critical to that, but we need to make sure it's really directed to the right kind of stuff. And I think this means, for me, thinking a little differently about the objectives that we want our infrastructure investment to achieve. And a lot of that, to me, again, is like, how does infrastructure relate to place? How can we direct infrastructure to make places work better? And my research on the kind of impacts of COVID on the built environment has kind of thrown up a few, not necessarily new priorities, but perhaps more urgent priorities that I'll just kind of run through now that I think should shape infrastructure going forward. So first is infrastructure that explicitly tackles place-based inequality. You know, we know that COVID-19's had this disproportionate impact on those already living in poverty, especially BAME communities. And this is in part due to existing inequalities within the built environment, right? It's, too many people living in overcrowded and poor quality housing, too many people living in areas that lack accessibility to green space, clean air, local shops, services, lack space for walking and cycling, things like that. And as the health crisis, we know the health crisis is going to evolve now into a kind of looming, economic crisis, and these inequalities are going to get much worse. And so fixing this, I think, means directing infrastructure investment more explicitly to support the regeneration of disadvantaged and deprived areas, kind of within existing towns and cities, really, for me. So focusing on real kind of, dramatic increases in the quantity and quality of green space, carrying out building retrofit to improve energy and water efficiency and just make homes better to live in, making sure that everyone has access to high-speed broadband. I mean, it also means investing in some of the kind of critical utility infrastructure upgrades that we need to accommodate the delivery of, much needed new affordable housing, again, within existing towns and cities where that kind of growth can unlock wider benefits rather than perhaps the kind of constant throwing of infrastructure cash at unlocking greenfield housing sites kind of on the periphery of things. That just serves to kind of sprawl things out and kind of undermines urban regeneration in a lot of ways, in my view. A key part of this too that deserves its own mention is that we need much greater levels of investment in healthy and affordable and low carbon mobility solutions. It's been touched on by everybody else already, but one of the few kind of positive outcomes that we've seen during lockdown has been this reorientation of urban space towards walking and cycling. But for me, this really flags up that actually a lot of local authorities have been diligently working away on this issue for many, many years, often in the face of very limited funding and limited political support. But those places that have been plugging away at walking and cycling have actually proven to be far more resilient during this crisis. And we can see that investment really delivers a huge range of benefits. So that's good, and we need more of that. But there are, of course, massive challenges coming to the transport sector as well. Public transport operators are in a pretty deep financial hole at the moment, and we're seeing car use starting to rise again as a kind of safe mode of transport, bringing all those problems of congestion, pollution, accidents, carbon emissions, etc., that we kind of briefly did away with during lockdown. So if we're going to build our way out of this crisis with infrastructure investment, then public and active travel needs to be really at the forefront, I think, in terms of not just investment in new stuff, but subsidy and keeping what we have going already, which is a slightly different issue. And we also need to resolve, I think, some of the kind of governance and funding barriers that previously made it just so hard for local authorities to make progress on this agenda and to genuinely tackle car dependency. The third point I want to make is that we also need infrastructure investment to enable this kind of much greater green industrial revolution that we see a lot of people talking about. Just during COVID, we've seen big kind of structural changes to the nature and location of economic activity. This has accelerated some trends that were already underway, like the rise in home working and flexible working, obviously. But we've also seen some quite interesting new issues, like the potential drop in demand for kind of commercial real estate, the complete collapse of employment in some specific locations, like around Gatwick Airport and some of the big vehicle manufacturers. At the same time, we know, although we don't really talk about it that much, that the transition to a zero carbon economy is going to lead to even more radical changes in not just the types of jobs we do, but where that economic activity takes place across the country. Now is the time to think about what are the needs of those sectors that can really thrive and create jobs in a net zero carbon economy. What types of places do we need to attract those businesses? What kinds of labor and housing markets will they create? What are the infrastructure needs of these sectors, be that transport, digital, utilities, green infrastructure, etc. And how can we start to provide infrastructure that supports that type of economic growth now? And at the same time, a ton of places are really going to struggle over the coming decades from the loss of employment in sectors which aren't, compatible with a zero carbon future, or places that aren't going to be able to really recover from COVID-19 and where the scars are just going to be too deep. What kind of infrastructure do we need there to help them adapt and kind of rediscover themselves and change? A final mention as well, other speakers have touched on kind of specifically energy infrastructure. I mean, it's been kind of fascinating during lockdown. We've seen this kind of combination of it's been driven in part by kind of quite nice sunny weather, but we've seen this kind of little glimpse of this future where there has been lower energy demand, and a lot of that demand's been met by renewables, and we've seen lower greenhouse gas emissions that are kind of starting to head us on the trajectory that we need to see consistently made now if we want to make any progress on tackling climate change. But these measures have all been driven by kind of terrible health crisis rather than a positive vision for where we want to get to in the future. Now what we need obviously is kind of big structural change, big structural changes to lock this in, and also kind of speed up the transition too. So I mean, it was touched on by Rachel and Tim as well. This is the real infrastructure challenge of our time. How the hell do we deliver all the infrastructure we need to achieve net zero carbon? This will require very comprehensive programs of building retrofits, the rollout of low carbon heat and transport networks within cities, smart energy grids, electric vehicle charging points. The list is almost endless, and it's going to require a lot of ripping up and relaying of the infrastructure that we have. So those are the kinds of infrastructure priorities that really stand out for me, not just in terms of recovering from COVID, but also setting us kind of towards the future that we want. And I think it seems very obvious that some of this stuff can be solved by big kind of shiny national level infrastructure projects, but a lot of it is kind of smaller and more localized. It's the integration and coordination of lots of different types of infrastructure into a given place. And with the kind of traditional distinctions between infrastructure becoming increasingly blurred, so between transport, energy, digital, water, green space, the kind of the silos or the sectors that we used to plan this infrastructure in don't really make so much sense anymore. So what we're interested in, obviously, at the RTPI, and I would say this is kind of what's the role of planning here. I think it can, although it might not always do it well at the moment. It's really important to have a good planning system in place that can identify these kind of shovel-ready projects that actually deliver a really wide range of benefits for place, and to use the planning system to help direct infrastructure investment towards those. There's a few elements within the planning system that are really important that we want to maintain and strengthen. Firstly, it's probably one of the best structures that we have for actually listening and engaging with communities and businesses about their concerns and needs and aspirations for place, and making sure that our priorities for infrastructure investment actually deliver what people really want in a kind of democratic way. Secondly, planning, again, when done well, is a really good way to actually think about how you break with past trends and to align infrastructure investment with a positive vision for the future of place. It's again something that we don't do so much of in this country recently, but it is a really important component. Thirdly, good strategic planning that operates at a larger than local level, that looks across different sectors, is really important to align infrastructure investment again to solutions that give you the maximum bang for buck. And fourthly, these are super uncertain times, and like none of us, we're all kind of speculating, but none of us really know what's going to happen in the future. It's crises are going to intersect in multiple very, very complex ways. And what we need is a planning system that can provide some flexibility and adaptability, helping us to prioritize low regret options and interventions that can actually deliver positive change under multiple different scenarios, and making sure that we're not locking us into a single path that's not going to be resilient to a sudden, to whatever the next crisis is that rolls around that we probably won't see coming. So just to wrap up, this is what we want planning to do and what we need planning to do. I think the challenge is that the kind of local planning system in this country has been weakened by a decade of austerity and successive deregulation, and it's kind of come to be viewed by successive governments in quite a narrow way as a kind of regulatory process for basically boosting market-led housing delivery, something that you can kind of cut back and scale back in times of crisis to get the construction sector moving again. But that's not really what planning should be. It should be this mechanism for setting out a positive vision for place, identifying the infrastructure that's needed to deliver it, and helping to coordinate and deliver that on the ground. And that's what we really want. So I think when we talk about, when we're speaking to government about the kind of capital investment that we want in different types of infrastructure, we also need to be really careful to remember to call for the resources necessary at the local level to actually plan that infrastructure and deliver it in a much more joined up and integrated way, so that we're not just doing a transport project over here or a social infrastructure project over here. We're actually trying to achieve multiple economic, social, environmental objectives on the ground. So that's the role of that's how I kind of see trying to link up planning and infrastructure. I hope that makes sense. And I'll leave it there. I don't want to waffle on too long, but I hope that helps.
Thanks very much, James, for those comments. Interesting and unsurprising, given who you work for that you talked about the role of the planning system as well, which is often much maligned, but I think you made a really important point in suggesting that good planning can make a real difference, particularly good strategic planning, and also that in very uncertain times we need a flexible system so that we can actually pivot where necessary on some of these plans going forward. Already seen some questions coming through in the questions box, so do please keep those coming, our audience. And again, if you want to put your firm's name there, then feel free to do that as well. Moving on to our next speaker, and hopefully we can hear him. We had a few technical issues before we started. I've just heard him to indicate that he is actually with us, and that next speaker is Richard Throwfall, who's a global head of infrastructure at KPMG. Richard has got vast experience in the field of infrastructure policy, governance, strategy and financing, advising both public and private sector clients. Richard is also a fellow of the ICE, and he's also worked in government in the past for the Department of Transport. And I know from having worked with him in the past that he has a vast network of contacts across our sector, and I'm sure we'll have some very interesting views about the future of what are the things that we ought to be looking out for. So, Richard, we're all eagerly awaiting your insights. Over to you.
Well, firstly, I'm hoping you can hear me, given that we couldn't earlier.
Yes, we can hear
Can
you
you
loud
do
and
so?
clear. Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Fine. Right. There we go. The digital economy is working in Yorkshire. Fantastic. So the exam question was, how is infrastructure going to look different post-COVID? And I'm with Rachel, actually. I don't think it's going to look much different at all. And it's not going to look much different at all because, as you said, Rachel, we've got a huge amount of legacy infrastructure stock. And let's be honest, the infrastructure schemes we bring forward take decades and decades to prepare, and sort of suddenly jumping anything to the top of the list is nearby impossible. But I also think we're slightly at risk of dare I say it, COVID obsession. A huge amount of what we're seeing, I think, in the, you know, if you imagine looking back from 50 or 60 years into the future, you know, I'm a great believer that this is a blip. That a lot of what we're talking about, although it feels very big at the moment because we're smack in the middle of it, it'll be a ripple on the surface of much bigger trends that are going on in our society. And I think Rachel again is right, and Tim as well, that necessarily something like this has given a nudge, in some cases positive, in some cases negative. But I'm going to argue that it hasn't really shifted some of these sort of more tectonic shifts in what we're seeing. And I want to touch very quickly on five. One I'll call sustainable society, one digital economy, three peak car, four livable cities, to pick up on a lot of what James, I think, has very rightly said, and five, surprisingly, I think we haven't really talked about construction technology particularly. I want to just touch on that as well. So to take each very quickly in turn. So for sure, one of the remarkable things about what we have seen over the last 4 or 5 months is the sharpening of perceptions of the vulnerability of society. And undoubtedly, in fact, there was a survey only a month ago by the Centre for Climate Change here that showed that the percentage of respondents, public respondents, who thought that action on climate change was incredibly urgent or very urgent had gone from sort of 60 to 75% since, you know, they last surveyed a year ago to just now. So that's all very encouraging. We've seen things like the sort of 75 billion European Green Deal. We've seen things like the restrictions imposed on Air France, that they can't compete with train lines shorter than the 2.5 hours of duration. So there's good stuff in this space, but I'm also reflecting that it was a full 2 years ago that when KPMG publishes, as it does each year, its emerging trends, we said sustainability goes mainstream in the infrastructure space. I'm reflecting that it was a year ago that we were seeing the dramatic rise in terms of the amount of investor money that was going into green bonds, for example, or the impact investing space. It was January when we were still thinking that this was something that was going to be confined to China, that the World Economic Forum brought out its report showing that all 5 of the top risks facing the world were environmental risks. And, you know, if that nudges us towards more faster rollout of EV charging, yet another go, hopefully not abortively this time, at carbon capture and storage, you know, if it really accelerates building retrofit work, great. But to be honest, I suspect, you know, we're kidding ourselves to some extent, and a lot of this will be at the margins of what was going to happen anyway. I open that one up for debate. Digital economy. Similar story. So sure, you know, we've all unfortunately got used to trying to do these things from our homes. Frankly, I'll be first in the queue to actually do a real meeting over a coffee as soon as it becomes possible. But it was Theresa May's government that had already committed to full fibre rollout, albeit by 2033, which many of us said was ridiculously too slow. Now this government, before COVID, had said the objective was, what was the exact language that they used? Effectively broadband connect, you know, for high-speed broadband connectivity by 2025 to everywhere, conveniently framed in a way that it makes it almost immeasurable. But you know, we need to be doing this loads faster. We need to be doing it loads faster because South Korea's already got over 90% full fibre connectivity, and Spain's got over 70%, and so on. So again, it's just taking us in the direction I would argue that we were going in anyway. It's wrapped up into the city debate, isn't it? Because Tim, you said, and you know, our chief economist has said, and loads of people are saying, gosh, this is going to change the way we live. You know, our cities are going to continue to some extent to be drained of people going into them. That's going to take the pressure off public transport, so that'll all sort itself out. It's all great because it relies on the idea that as a society we're going to be content with a world in which we socialise with our neighbours in the Fox and Hounds each evening, rather than all bar one with our colleagues in the middle of a thriving city centre. I don't buy it. I think the second that the vast majority of the earning society get their heads around the fact that actually the chances of dying of this thing are less than the chances of a household accident, then gradually we will recover a sense of perspective on it, and we'll drift back into the cities. And maybe that will take 6 months or a year, but in long-term trends, I don't see it carrying. That then takes us into the transport debate, which I think is becoming actually the most significant issue in the whole thing, because as Rachel said, the perceived health risk of being on mass public transport. I just think one way or another we've got to get over it, because we can't possibly embrace the only alternative, which is that people, again, as James has said, rush back into their cars with all of the pollution and congestion and all of the implications of that. I've heard it say, I mean, I'm a great proponent of the future of autonomous vehicles and technology within the transport space generally, but we can't fool ourselves that somehow that's going to fix the problem, because even though we might all hopefully very soon be in non-polluting electric cars, if we're all rattling around in our own non-polluting electric car, the whole country is going to be completely jammed solid. And then you come back to the argument that says, well, everyone's just going to work from home anyway, and I'm back into my place of I think the flexibility, I think the ability for individuals to choose on occasion to do it, or indeed perhaps some individuals to choose to do it a lot, fine. But I noticed Canary Wharf Group's just launched the plans for its 3.8 million square feet new development at North Quay. So I'm not sure they're voting for a world in which they think that the whole sort of city, London living and working scene is about to evaporate. And yes, it's great that we see a rise in active transport and cycling and walking. I've seen some numbers about the numbers of new bikes that have been sold, and some no doubt forlorn hope that into the winter people will continue to ride them. I'd love that to be set against some statistics for the number of people that have bought cars. I've been told that demand for second-hand small cars has leapt because people who previously took the train into work have decided to buy a small car instead. So I don't think we should fool ourselves that a walking and cycling revolution is about to engulf the wetness of the UK any more than the Prime Minister's idea that we're all going to turn into an outdoor cafe society. And last but not least, the construction technology piece. I think this is an interesting area. If sustainability has been given a positive nudge, if digital economy has been given a positive nudge, if peak cars been given a negative nudge, if livable cities have had a negative nudge, we've got a really interesting thing going on in the construction space, which is we knew it was a pretty inefficient business. The IPA itself said a few years back in one of its papers that we should be able to build at least 40% more for the money we spend because of the inefficiency in the construction industry. Now, of course, social distancing and all of the other health requirements around sites have smacked the efficiency of the industry even more. That will, I hope, provide a positive impetus towards a much greater move towards modern methods of construction, off-site manufacturing, and so on. And I'm quite encouraged that the government seems to have got its bit between the teeth on that, and that one of the elements of Project Speed, as it's called, that's coming out of the Cabinet Office is going to be revised procurement guidance that will nudge infrastructure procurers into the direction of trying to drive more technology through the industry generally. All great stuff, but again, we were well on the way towards recognising that we needed to bring technology into this industry anyway. So this is all about incremental change, and it's all about long-term trends, and it's not all about COVID.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Richard, for what some people would say was a bit of a reality check on where we are on these issues. As you say, there is a lot of talk about the crisis at the present time, and a certain degree of from some people that it's going to change everything. I think clearly, without putting words into your mouth, it seemed like you were coming down on the side of yes, it will change some things, but actually we were heading in a particular direction anyway. But also, people will probably go back to to working how they worked before, albeit that it might take a little bit of time, perhaps a year or so. I think personally, I think that's a bold claim. Looking at some of the sectors that are certainly not going to be the same ever again. Some of them are not even going to exist. Now, some people might argue that that's just one of the things that happens within society. But others would say, there's an opportunity here. And a number of our speakers have actually spoken about the real opportunity to make change, and also to actually maybe fast track, to come back to the points that you raised there, some of the things that we were doing, anyway. So, just before we, getting into the questions, of which we've got a lot, I just want to sort of ask, is it the case? Do you agree with the point that Richard made, that actually we will end up probably sooner rather going back to the way we were before, particularly in an office situation, and what that might mean for how we, what's the view around our virtual table here on that? And if I can start off with Tim first, what's your view on that?
Richard is provocative as ever, and he makes some very good points. And actually, the difference between us is quite small. I personally never worked from home beforehand because it was really difficult. I had lots of meetings. I never made my diary work. I can see myself working a day a week afterwards. Richard, you live up in North Yorkshire. You balance your diary. You didn't come into London 5 days a week beforehand. So we're getting our own staff surveys done in Arab to work out what's happening. And currently people are saying they want to work from, after this is all over, notionally they say they like to work 2.5 days a week from home. We suspect that once people get back into things, I agree with you, people will probably actually get into going to a pub with their friends, will need to go shopping, will need to have a meeting they need to get to. But equally, I think there's some changes that were going to happen. We've all suddenly got used to Teams and Zoom and other ways, and even GoToWebinar, and there's that's not going to go away. So I think the old days where you have to have 7 people in the room to have a meeting and you wait till 7 people could get there will never happen again. I think the fact that I might work 1 day a week on average from home means there's a 20% drop in transport demand. And that was happening beforehand, before, and we're both in the same thing. It's exacerbating existing trends. I don't believe it's going to be a massive revolution, but I believe that the economics of some new lines will be threatened by the changes. Equally, large parts of what's happening around the UK, there's massive pent-up demand for public transport and better ways of moving. I agree with you, it's a blip, but equally, I think, I mean, East Asia has had 3 or 4 outbreaks of COVID-like disease in the last 15, 20 years, and are now actually much better prepared for them. We will be much better prepared for the next one, I hope. I hope we don't make the mistakes and take as long to learn the lessons that we should have done this time. So I think there are changes that are fundamental that were happening anyway. Many of them are quite good, some of them are not quite so good. I totally agree with the point we need to get people back onto public transport and active travel, and there's some good and bad bits in all of this. So I think your point that you're making, that it's not going to change, is you don't believe either. And the point you were inferring I was saying is going to be massive change isn't true either. I think it's somewhere in between. I think there will be a change that we're going to get to, which will, but the change is a long-term trend. I agree with you utterly on that.
Thanks, Tim. Rachel, what's your view on this? I mean, presumably you've been grappling with obviously the immediate effects of lockdown and everything else, and clearly the experience of going through that process of working from home, the Zoom, the Teams, everything that people have been speaking about. You know, how do you think things are going to shape up?
So yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've all had a similar experience. I guess though I'm starting from a slightly different personal point of view here. So I've worked flexibly, actually, although full time, for 12 years since having kids. So actually, the experience of working from home for me, it's been a treat for the last 12 years. And it's like, well, why did it take you guys so long to figure it out? And by the way, it's not dossing from home. Who was it who said that? Was it you, Tim? Anyway, no. For me, it's some of my most productive days actually in recent years have been sitting quietly and just getting on with it. But I mean, around the bigger point, I guess, I think we have to remember in this conversation and with this particular audience, we probably are amongst the lucky ones here. We can, a lot of us, work from home. We do things that are professional services, which means that actually, as long as you've got your brain on and you've got the ability to connect with other people through these various Teams, Zoom, whatever else it might be, as I say, we are the lucky ones. There are a lot of people who can't do their jobs from home, actually, because of the nature of what they do, and no amount of telling them to work from home is going to make a difference. So I think we will see demand for movement, continue to climb back up. I think that the trick is to manage the pieces around those essential movements and so on, in terms of actually how we put that back together again, because the last thing we want is actually, to some extent, exactly what's happening, which is people going out, for example, and picking up those second cars or driving more than they used to, and particularly driving on their own and not sharing vehicles and so on, which obviously of course at the moment is tricky. So in terms of where we go with it, I mean, some of the interesting work that we've been up to recently has actually been around a more strategic look at some of the pieces to do with first mile and last mile connectivity, because very often the reason why people have historically used their car to get around, say, is because they actually don't have other options, particularly for longer trips. So there are some really interesting ways of cutting different data sets together to think about, well, why is it that people are finding it so difficult to get from, wherever it might be, to say a couple of miles away? It should be entirely possible to walk or cycle or take some form of public transport to connect that whole trip together. But for some reason, some of those links are missing, and actually investment in some of those might be the longer run key to a more sustainable, I suppose, whole system approach to the way that we actually move around going forward. Just really briefly on the thought around you know, things like office space and so on, how that goes forward. I guess similar to the way that Tim was saying, and I'm guessing that all businesses are fairly similar in our collective space right now. Yeah, similarly, WSP is having a really big think about, you know, what does this mean in terms of the future need for office space, and where does it need to be, and how much do we need? And again, you can look at Canary Wharf, you can look at smaller centres all over the, you know, it doesn't matter where you look. Those same conversations, they are happening and they are real, and I think we will see significant change. I'm guessing James may have something to say about some of the changes to the planning system that appear to be being rattled through in terms of the potential for things to change really quite fast in terms of land uses, particularly around, you know, some of the existing centres and so on. And what does that mean in terms of the sort of behaviour we're then going to be encouraging, and the sort of places we're going to be creating? I think there's quite a danger moment in there somewhere, actually, where, you know, one of those like more haste, less speed type moments, perhaps, in terms of when we look back at it and we think, oh my goodness me, is that what we meant? Yeah, it's interesting.
Thanks, Rachel. Just to bring James in on that from maybe a planning perspective, I mean, you're already seeing, okay, driven by some of the later stage in the measures to get us, you know, back to, you know, whatever the new, and we won't say the second N because Rachel doesn't like us using it. But anyway, there are obviously a lot of issues, you know, in terms of maybe the way that cities are going to be planned in the future. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? Are you hearing anything from, you know, from your sort of stakeholders around this issue? What changes are we likely to see there?
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of fluctuate on this. Sometimes I feel a bit more in the kind of Richard camp sometimes, and think that things are actually fairly sticky and will kind of flip back to the way things were. But I guess to me it's increasingly less about the kinds of changes that we'll see as a result of the health crisis. It's more about what the impact of the recession will be, really, on, you know, what are the market signals going to be. You know, when it comes to whether people will want to work in an office or not, I kind of agree with Rachel. You know, we're talking here about the people who have the choice to think about whether they work from home or go into the office. But I mean, surely in what's looking to be a very prolonged, pretty severe recession, we're going to see a lot of companies who are forced to relocate or to downscale or to shift entirely to virtual offices to keep afloat. That might see the growth in business activity in more suburban locations, ex-urban locations, places where you can, afford to have the space that you need. I think the same with households as well. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are paying a premium to live in places which have good accessibility to where they work, even if you weaken that tie a little bit for people who are currently living in pretty grim small houses, just so they can, you know, get to a range of jobs and things. My kind of hunch is that even if you weaken that connection a little bit with increased home working, then people may choose to relocate, may decide that actually the trade-off they were making around indoor space versus cool stuff outside is tilted a little bit, and actually a bit more private space is nice, a garden is nice, you know, room for family members takes precedence. You know, I think there are some little shifts like this which could cumulatively have quite big impact on the way that we travel. But the important thing for me, I guess, is that we don't necessarily want the market forces to just dictate what happens to our towns and cities, right? We want to decide the future that we want for them and then plan for how to get there. And, you know, Rachel alluded to the kind of government's planning reforms, which are a kind of extension of what's been going on for a while, kind of taking more things basically outside of the kind of planning's ability to control them, and just making it easier to change uses between building types, things like that. And again, you know, I think when you couple the removal of planning controls with quite seismic shifts to the market, to the collapse of high streets, to the changes in the way that people do things, I think you could end up with some pretty perverse outcomes there that you don't necessarily want to see. You know, the incentive for commercial buildings to possibly eject their tenants and kind of wind them down so they can turn them into more profitable housing. The same for retail as well. You know, if you can change a building from a former commercial or industrial or resident or retail use to residential without really any planning controls, then coupled with the fact it's going to be quite hard to make money in certain areas of the retail sector going forward, I think you could see a lot of buildings change use without really any ability to even, not necessarily even control them, but even to understand what those shifts look like. So what I'm kind of interested in really from a planning perspective is how do we monitor this? How do we monitor these changes that are going on? Because everyone is kind of speculating, but we're going to need really quite fine-grained data to make sure that we know what these trends are, how they're playing out, and we can actually adapt our plans and adapt our investment priorities to make the most of good opportunities where we see them, to like maximize the benefit of some of these positive trends, like a little bit more working from home and the impact on peak travel demand, but also make sure that we're not heading in a direction that we don't want to go in. And I feel like in a lot of cases we're kind of sleepwalking into this future rather than deciding what we want it to be and figuring out how we want to get there.
Thanks for that, James. Just sparked a very interesting conversation there, really. The economy's been mentioned here, and a couple of our speakers have talked about, the coming recession could have quite a profound effect on the sector. How do you view that? I mean, have you, as KPMG, been doing any sort of research on that up to now? How do you think that the a potential recession could have an effect on the way that the industry works?
So we've produced a whole series of pieces pretty much every month since the lockdown on what we think the economic consequences are likely to be or could be of although taking, I think, James's last health warning, I think there's vast amounts of speculation going on here and a degree of uncertainty everywhere. One of the things that we've highlighted repeatedly, though, is what appears to be the high risk that the recession is unequal in its impact geographically around the country, and that heading in diametrically the opposite direction to where no doubt the government would want, given its levelling up agenda, that the parts of the country that were already struggling are the ones that then become even harder hit through the recession, and so particularly the northern towns and cities and more outlying and coastal areas and so on seem to be likely to take the brunt of the economic hit. In terms of the sector as a whole, the big mitigator of that, which I believe Tim referred to right at the beginning, is the recognition that this government, as indeed most governments in the world, are looking to the construction sector as one of the prime drivers of economic stimulus and deliberately pushing money into that sector in order to, because we've long recognised that it's one of the quickest ways to get money into an economy is through construction spend, and I think therefore that will to some degree insulate this sector, particularly from the sort of activity that can be driven by that stimulus. So sort of major government-led infrastructure projects and so on. If you look sectorally across the industry, then it would be no surprise to draw the conclusion that the commercial sector is going to be the part that's going to take the biggest hit, because you're not going to see that commercial demand coming through, because even though Tim and I may have some difference, narrow or otherwise, about the future occupancy of office space, you'd be a brave company that started to go out there and start building lots more new office space, or indeed we're going to for sure be in a period where businesses are going to be battening down their hatches from a financial point of view, and therefore will be avoiding the sort of discretionary spend that would be associated with sort of relocations or new sites and so on.
Okay, thanks for that, Richard. We're going to get to some questions now, or some more questions, and I'm going to ask our panelists if it can be as brief as possible, because I want to get as many of these in as we possibly can. Paul Spears asks, which new KPIs will be considered to help avoid knee-jerk infrastructure schemes coming forward? And how will they relate to the bigger climate agenda? to deal with that opportunity. So I think this speaks to the questions that we've had around. We don't want to build too quickly. We want to think about it, and everything's got to be related to the climate change agenda. So, what new KPIs should we be considering, to actually deal with that? And I'll throw that question first of all to Tim Chapman, if he can be as brief as possible, Tim.
Thanks, Andy. Answering quickly, PAS 2080 is a standard that gives whole life measurement of carbon in infrastructure. It's an excellent standard and allows us to make rational decisions. It's been used sparingly for a small number of schemes. Whole life carbon is the only metric. Invest to save carbon long term, but within that, there's some no-brain decisions. Electrification of rail, providing EV charging points, more cycle lanes, lots of stuff about active travel. All of the things, but the KPI is whole life carbon, and that's something we should actually evaluate every project against. Money is really important. Green book side of things, whole life carbon should be equally important for choosing what we do. We're capable of looking at two metrics and optimizing on both. Translating carbon into money, I think, is bonkers, because they're different issues, different scales, different stuff. And if you convert a longer answer, which I won't give now, as to why they're different, but we must be able to optimize on two variables.
Okay, Rachel, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I broadly do agree. I would also say you've got the wrong panel if you want brief answers, but there we go. But I think you're absolutely right. I think for me, though, in amongst everything that Tim's just said there, we need to get much better at being consistent in understanding the change in carbon that we're talking about, because I don't think at the moment we have a way of really understanding what it would have been if we built it, if you like, normally, and what it could be if we actually thought about it, and getting that real understanding embedded across the industry at all different stages of the, from the very concept ideas right the way through the design, through the build, etc. So I think there's loads we can do there. And I think the other piece is, while we don't want too many metrics, we then need to lever in somehow a more meaningful way of looking at those social outcomes, the justice, social justice side of things. Okay,
and I'm not going to ask everyone the same question, because we'll be here all night, but it's interesting on this issue of carbon, and that is, I read somewhere recently that the actual CO2 is on the increase again, because of people's reluctance to take public transport. So isn't there a danger here that in the desire to jumpstart the economy after this crisis, could that mean that net zero and everything else, could it mean that we end up with complete business as usual, and some of these important issues are actually lost? Richard, your thoughts?
I think we're already seeing that, and completely endorse what Rachel said earlier, which is we need government to get on the front foot in terms of encouraging people back onto public transport. And indeed, the CBI released a report on the future of commuting last Thursday that KPMG had a hand in, which made the same point very, very strongly. So I do think we need to just concentrate really hard on that. Against that, one of the extraordinary things I've noticed is the way in which all businesses are seized now with the importance of sustainability and climate. It's gone right to it used to be pushed off the end of the board to the sustainability director. Today it's a mandate that's held by the chief exec and the board itself, and I don't think that's going away.
Okay. The other thing that strikes me as well on all of these things is we talk about, we need government leadership. We need, those, with the levers of power to sort of, take a leadership position. But Kristen McCaskill from the University of Cambridge has asked an interesting question. She said, as engineers, did we fail in our roles to not be more proactive and lead in making some of these changes, like the whole climate agenda being discussed now? And it's often something that strikes me that, we have some fantastic ideas in our industry, but I do think sometimes we're a little bit backward in coming forward. And we should actually be saying to government, look, this is the score, deal with it. We're the experts, listen to us. Is that fair, or am I being a little bit unfair there? Tim, what's your view on that?
I agree utterly. I mean, very good question from Kristen. We need to lead, which means we need to actually have the right answers. We need to explain them well. I think too often we have the right answers, but then don't explain them well or explain them to the wrong people. The critical thing is having a good, clear message which we can persuade politicians with, which would chime with their agenda. So at the moment, we have a government which some people support, some people don't, but it's got a very clear levelling up agenda, which is a really good thing. So we need to put aside political thoughts and make sure we engage with the right message, provide the right message at the right time with the right levers. And we have been really, really bad. Sorry, I almost used a rude word. We've been really bad at that.
Yeah, and Dominic Cummings himself talked about attracting misfits into government. Not that we're misfits in the construction industry, of course. You know, government are listening to the pontifications of the Royal Town Planning Institute. You said yourself there's a danger that we might be sleepwalking our way into the future. How are you getting your message across? How are you getting the government to listen?
I mean, just to link up, I guess, some of the last few things we were just talking about, it's trying to make sure that all of our decisions around infrastructure investment and the speeding up of housing delivery are as linked up as possible. I think quite often government sees them as two different things. When they're looking at ways to stimulate the economy, you know, the previous approach for the last number of decades really has just been, you know, a ton of road building, it stimulates the economy, unlocks a bunch of housing, that's all good. And you know, that's kind of feel like that's the route that we're heading down again, and that just can't be the case. But to link it back up to what Tim was saying as well, and the question about KPIs, I think if we have, you know, the climate crisis and the legal net zero carbon target are the kind of strongest tools we have here, but we need to make sure that we aren't just looking at infrastructure projects in isolation and the carbon impacts that they have in isolation from the building materials, from how they operate, etc. What we're always trying to push for is that different infrastructure solutions have impacts on land use. You know, building a ton of roads, looking, say, at America as a neat example, basically encourages places to sprawl, stuff gets more spread out, travel behaviors change, carbon emissions go up. If we could factor in the consequences of land use change on our infrastructure decision making, model the carbon impacts in a much more holistic way, I think that would actually fundamentally reshape what it would both link up the infrastructure and the housing agenda, and I think it would probably reshape our infrastructure priorities back towards what Tim was mentioning, you know, the things that actually drive urban regeneration, that help people travel more sustainably, that encourage compact transit-oriented patterns of settlement growth. You know, these are the kind of fundamental messages we're trying to make, is that you've got to think about infrastructure housing in place in a joined up way. And I think it's just genuinely quite hard actually for to do that at a central government level. It's departments tackle different things. That's where their expertise is, and that's just kind of how it would be. So actually, I think one of the strongest solutions for this is just devolution. You know, give a lot more of the funding and the powers and responsibilities to mayoral combined authorities, county councils, unitaries. Actually, have them make the decisions, because it's at that slightly lower down the scale that you can better link all of these different types of agendas up. It is genuinely just tricky to do at a central government level.
Devolution is obviously an important issue, and something that we're going to return to in the autumn with hopefully a couple of mayoral round tables. But another question's come through from Hugo Sutherland, who's a director of Portland Communications. He's asking a question here, and I think this speaks to the politics of infrastructure as well. What more can we do to protect big projects from the 5-year parliamentary pattern, which militates against long-term planning and ends up delaying or undermining so many projects? Richard, you've worked in government in the past. How do we get that longer view to be adopted? How do we get all parties really to buy into a shared vision of what needs to happen?
So I think we've actually made real progress in this in the last 5-6 years. I think the creation of the National Infrastructure Commission was a seminal moment, and I think the quality of what it has produced has been absolutely excellent. The only pity, the only thing that you know, myself and I suspect everyone else on this panel railed against at the time was the government drawing back on making it actually a statutory body. and by not doing so, it also meant that it didn't lock in statutory timescales for government's own response. As a result of which we're now seeing the continued delay in the production of the country's infrastructure strategy. So that's the one thing that I would like to see happen now, is put the NIC on a proper statutory footing, so that this gets locked in. But we also have to accept, at the end of the day, we're in a democratic society, and I don't think it ever has been or should be the role of the NIC or any other body to tie politicians' hands. We make progress by creating really, really convincing cases for what we do that then draw broad political support.
And if I can just add to that, that's happened on carbon. So going back to 2008 in the Climate Change Act, David Mackay of Cambridge University persuaded Ed Miliband, then Energy Secretary, to do the Climate Change Act. There's been a very broad political consensus in the UK. UK is leading on it. Some of the stuff's not happening quickly enough, but actually overall the political support for low carbon has been excellent throughout. There's a couple of wrinkles along the way. I was really disappointed when some of the electrifications were canned, which should have continued. But actually, they're blips on overall a very positive cross-party consensus journey. I think we can learn from that. And again, which the NIC and IPA bake in the basis for doing a lot of that.
We're actually at the point where we're going to ask our last question. Unfortunately, the time's flown by, as it always does on these occasions. So the question I've got is, notwithstanding that there might be some, coalescence of view around the table on the extent of any changes that we're going to get as a result of the current crisis, let's just assume that there are going to be some changes to infrastructure and how we go about things. I'll ask the panel in turn, what would you like to see as the lasting change as far as infrastructure is concerned? And it could be how we go about it. It could be the type of infrastructure that we might have going forward. What do you want to see as a lasting legacy of, the previous period that we've actually been through, which again, we've got to remind ourselves has only been a number of months. It's not like it's been a year, years and years. But what do you think from our sector's point of view would you like to see, the lasting? A few sentences, and I'm going to go first of all back to Richard on that one, if I may. Richard.
Net zero environmental commitments in all its forms, but if I was to pick one single thing which is short term and immediate, it would be getting people into electric vehicles, because I think that's got one of the biggest potential impacts for the greening of our society and indeed the cleaning of our skies.
Thanks, Richard. James, your view on that? What's the one lasting legacy that you'd like to see?
I think I'll agree with net zero. Obviously, I think subsidy to keep our public transport network up and running at a high enough capacity to avoid people shifting to their cars, I think is the kind of immediate thing we need to be focused on.
Thanks, James. Tim.
Of the particular thing I would love to see a switch to is enabling everybody to travel in a very low carbon way. It picks up EVs, but actually, why do we need a car to go to, say, Durham or north of England? Why aren't there easier ways of doing it? Includes active travel, includes lots more walking and cycling, which actually makes towns and places better. It includes train transport, because actually, why are trains so expensive when actually the externalities of cars get ignored and everything else? Why can't we all go on holiday by train and go back to the 1950s in a nice way?
I certainly agree with.
You're trying to come to me. I think my signal's just dipped.
Rachel, go for it.
Sorry, my signal just dipped for a second there. Are you asking me to do my one now?
Yeah, you can go on, that's fine.
I'm assuming so. So for me, the thing around the biggest thing that could come out of COVID, I think something slightly different. I think it is time for us to try and figure out how to make sure that the wider public, politicians, etc., really recognise infrastructure for what it actually does, the contribution it makes, the positive contribution to net zero carbon, the fact that it's really relevant and it needs to be much more visible. I hope you heard that. Sorry.
Thanks very much for that, Rachel. I mean, I think, you know, that realization by politicians that this is a sector, as Richard described earlier when he said that it's become seen as one of the fastest ways of getting money into the economy. Obviously, it's crucial that that money's spent in the right place, I think, is a definite plus for the sector. And I think it's beholden on everyone who works in the sector, and certainly its leaders, to get that point across to government that actually the right stuff's got to be done in the right way. And I think that's a key message that we've got to keep hammering home to government, and we shouldn't be shy in putting that putting that message forward in any way, shape or form. Just got a few thank yous in concluding this today's webinar. Obviously, our panelists, Tim Chapman, Richard Throwfall, James Harris and Rachel Skinner, thank you very much indeed. I'd also like to thank Barton Willmore, our sponsors for this webinar series, for their assistance and support. I'd like to thank the audience for some very interesting questions, some of which we weren't able to ask because we just didn't have the time, and I'm sure we'll bank those for another day. Next week sees the final Infrastructure Intelligence webinar in our summer series, and we're actually going to look at the skills challenge for construction post-COVID, which I'm sure is a very important and serious discussion when we look at the potential economic downturn that the industry is actually going to face going forward. So do join us for that, same time, same place, 11 o'clock next Friday, for that. And we've got a really good panel from some key people within the industry who know a lot about not just the wider issue of skills and training, but they also know quite a lot about the current response to the crisis as well. So do join us next week for that if you can. Once again, thanks everybody for taking part, and hopefully we'll see you again next week or another Infrastructure Intelligence event. Before we close, everyone's going to wave goodbye. Have a great weekend, everyone, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks a lot, guys.